Most people don't wake up thinking, I'm punishing myself. They wake up tired, even after sleeping. They sit down to rest and feel oddly restless. They start something they care about and feel a quiet pressure in their chest before they've even begun. Nothing dramatic is happening, and yet something never fully settles. You might recognize this as the feeling of being behind, even when there's nothing specific you're behind on, or the sense that the day hasn't quite been earned yet, or that strange inability to enjoy a calm moment without a background hum of unease, as if you're forgetting something important. It's not loud, it doesn't announce itself as anxiety or fear. It's subtler than that. It's the feeling that you're never completely off duty. You can be doing something productive and still feel like it's not enough. You can be resting and feel like you shouldn't be. You can even be happy briefly and notice a part of you watching that happiness closely, as if waiting for it to be taken away or justified. For many people, this has become so normal that it doesn't register as a problem. It just feels like adulthood, like responsibility, like being a serious person in the world. But notice how often your inner life feels like it's under review. You finish a task and instead of relief, your mind immediately moves to what should have been done better, faster, or sooner. You think about something you want to do, and before you even begin, a quiet calculation starts running in the background. Is this useful? Is this a good use of time? Will this matter later? Should you be doing something else? Even rest is rarely neutral, it's conditional. You rest because you're exhausted, you rest because you've reached a limit, you rest because you've done enough to justify stopping. Very few people rest because they feel permitted to. And over time, this creates a strange inner atmosphere. Life starts to feel like something you're managing rather than inhabiting. Days blur together, not because nothing happens, but because everything is filtered through the same internal pressure. You might notice it most clearly when you try to slow down. The moment you pause, something inside you tightens. Thoughts surface that weren't there a second ago. Concerns about the future, unfinished tasks, or vague worries with no clear object. The body stays alert even when nothing is required of it. It's as if letting go feels slightly unsafe. This isn't because you're doing something wrong, and it's not because you lack discipline, clarity, or purpose. It's because many people are living inside a constant state of self-monitoring without realizing it. From the outside, their lives may look fine, functional, responsible, even successful. But internally, there's a sense of being evaluated by an invisible standard that never quite explains itself and never fully signs off. You are allowed to continue, but not to arrive. You are allowed to try, but not to relax. You are allowed to live, but only under supervision. And because this supervision comes from inside, it feels personal. It feels like you, like your conscience, like your sense of responsibility, like the voice that's trying to keep things together. So you listen to it, you assume it must be necessary. After all, if you weren't a little hard on yourself, wouldn't everything fall apart? If you stopped questioning your choices, wouldn't you become careless? If you stopped worrying, wouldn't you miss something important? These questions rarely appear fully formed. They sit underneath your experience, shaping it quietly. They show up as hesitation, as tension, as the inability to fully enjoy what's right in front of you. And over time, they create a life that feels heavy in a way that's difficult to explain to others, because nothing is obviously wrong. There's no single crisis, no clear failure, no dramatic breakdown, just a persistent sense that something about living feels more effortful than it should, that you're always slightly braced, that you're carrying an internal posture of correction, even on good days. This is the part most people miss. They assume the discomfort means they need to do more work on themselves, become more disciplined, more aligned, more healed, more certain. But what if the discomfort isn't asking for improvement at all? What if it's pointing to the fact that the system you're living inside never actually lets you stand down? What if the pressure you feel isn't coming from life, but from an internal mechanism that learned long ago that vigilance equals safety? Before we name that mechanism, it's important to recognize it clearly, because once you see it, you realize this isn't about motivation or mindset or belief. It's about living as if you're permanently on probation with yourself. And most people don't even realize they're doing it. If you're listening to this and thinking, yes, this feels familiar, there's usually a second thought that follows almost immediately. It sounds something like, but if I didn't think this way, wouldn't things fall apart? And that question matters because it explains why doubt, worry, and guilt don't just appear in your life, they feel required. Most people don't experience these states as optional moods that come and go. They experience them as forms of responsibility. Worry feels like foresight. Doubt feels like intelligence. Guilt feels like a moral compass. And because they're framed that way internally, letting go of them can feel reckless, even wrong. So instead of asking, why am I like this? It's more accurate to ask, when did this start to feel necessary? For a lot of people, it begins early. Not because someone explicitly told them to be hard on themselves, but because they learned, quietly and repeatedly, that being alert, careful, and self-correcting reduced friction. It reduced conflict, it reduced disappointment, it kept things stable. Over time, the nervous system made a very simple association. Tension equals safety. And once that association is made, it doesn't feel like tension anymore. It feels like maturity. This is why people often describe themselves as just realistic or hard on themselves in a healthy way. From the inside, it doesn't feel punitive. It feels like staying ahead of potential problems. It feels like being a good person. It feels like preventing regret before it happens. But notice how little relief ever comes from it. You worry about the future, but the worry doesn't end once you've planned. You doubt your choices, but certainty never arrives. You hold guilt as a way of staying accountable, but it doesn't resolve into peace. It just shifts focus. That's because these states were never designed to end. They were designed to keep the system alert. And once alertness becomes the default, relaxation starts to feel unfamiliar, sometimes even unsafe. This is the part that's hard to see from the inside. When someone has lived for years with an internal posture of self-monitoring, the absence of that posture doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like exposure, like something important has been dropped, like you're about to miss something critical. So the mind steps in. It produces questions, reminders, concerns. It replays conversations. It revisits decisions. It scans for what could go wrong or what should be improved. Not because it enjoys doing this, but because it believes it's doing its job. And this is where many people get stuck. They assume the discomfort they feel is evidence that they need to fix themselves further, that there's another layer of insight they haven't reached yet. Another practice, another understanding, another breakthrough that will finally quiet things down. But the discomfort isn't coming from a lack of insight. It's coming from the fact that the system is organized around correction. When correction is the organizing principle, doubt and guilt don't show up as problems. They show up as signals that things are still under control, that you're paying attention, that you haven't become complacent. And this is why people often say things like, if I stop worrying, I'll become lazy, or if I stop doubting myself, I'll make bad choices, or if I let go of guilt, I'll lose my standards. These aren't irrational fears, they're logical conclusions inside a system where pressure has been equated with safety for a long time. And yet, if you look closely, that pressure rarely produces the life people are hoping for. Instead of clarity, it produces overthinking. Instead of responsibility, it produces hesitation. Instead of growth, it produces a kind of constant self-surveillance that drains energy quietly over time. But because it's familiar, it feels necessary. There's also an emotional layer to this that's worth naming. Many people learned, very subtly, that being at ease was something that could be withdrawn. Approval, connection, or stability felt conditional. Not necessarily because anyone intended harm, but because the environment rewarded alertness more than ease. So the body learned to stay slightly braced. Later in life, that brace gets interpreted as concern for the future, or seriousness about one's life, or a strong moral sense. And because those are valued traits, the underlying tension goes unquestioned. This is why telling someone to just stop worrying never works. From the inside, worry feels like the thing holding the structure together. Removing it feels like removing a support beam without knowing what will replace it. So people don't stop. They carry doubt into their work. They carry guilt into their rest. They carry worry into moments that could otherwise feel simple and complete. And slowly a pattern forms where life is lived under continuous internal commentary. Not cruel commentary necessarily. Often it's quiet, reasonable, almost sensible. But it never fully stands down. You might notice this in how hard it is to feel done with a task, done with a phase, done with a version of yourself. There's always something left to account for, something that could have been handled better, something that still needs monitoring. And when that becomes normal, the idea of living without it can feel abstract, unrealistic, even irresponsible. Which is why it's important to be very clear about this next point. Doubt, worry, and guilt did not arise because something is wrong with you. They arose because at some point they worked. They helped you navigate complexity. They helped you adapt. They helped you stay connected or safe or functional. But systems that are built for protection don't automatically dismantle themselves once the threat has passed. They keep running. And when they keep running unchecked, they stop feeling like protection and start feeling like punishment, even if that was never the intention. The problem isn't that these states exist. The problem is that they've been promoted from occasional signals to permanent supervisors. And as long as they hold that role, they will continue to feel compulsory. Let's name what's actually happening so we stop confusing structure with personality. Because if everything we've described so far is familiar, there's a strong chance you've assumed it's just you. Your temperament, your standards, your way of being serious about life. But what you're living inside isn't a trait, it's a system. And the reason it's been so hard to step out of is because it's been operating quietly, in the background, presenting itself as responsibility rather than what it actually is. Internal punishment. Now that phrase can sound dramatic at first, so let's slow it down and make it very ordinary. Internal punishment isn't about self-hatred. It's not about negative self-talk or beating yourself up in obvious ways. Most people who live inside it would never describe themselves as cruel to themselves. In fact, they often see themselves as fair, thoughtful, accountable. Internal punishment is simply what happens when the mind never stops correcting. It's the subtle but constant adjustment of yourself in response to an imagined standard. It's the feeling that something about you or your life needs to be improved before you're allowed to settle. It's the sense that ease has to be justified, earned, or delayed. And because this correction happens internally, it feels intimate, it feels personal, it feels like insight. So instead of saying, "I'm under pressure," people say things like, "I just need to get my act together," or "I can't relax until this is sorted," or "I'll feel better once I'm more consistent." Notice how the relief is always positioned in the future. What makes this a punishment system isn't the presence of standards, it's the absence of completion. There is no point at which the system says this is enough. There is no internal moment of arrival. You improve and the bar moves. You understand, and the understanding is immediately evaluated. You make progress and the focus shifts to what's still missing. So life becomes a series of provisional permissions. You're allowed to continue, but never to conclude. This is where people get confused, because on the surface it looks like growth, it looks like self-awareness, it looks like refinement, but structurally it's something else entirely. Growth has phases of effort and phases of rest. Correction has no off switch, and the nervous system knows the difference, even if the mind doesn't. Like, this is why so many people feel tired without being able to point to a clear reason. They're not exhausted from doing too much, they're exhausted from being constantly adjusted. Every action is followed by a review, every decision is followed by a second guess, every quiet moment is followed by an internal scan for what's been overlooked. And over time, this creates a very specific inner posture. You begin to relate to yourself the way an institution relates to a risk, something that needs oversight, something that can't quite be trusted to run on its own. So you monitor, you evaluate, you intervene, and because you are both the authority and the subject, it never feels resolved. This is also why encouragement rarely lands. When someone tells you you're doing well, it might register briefly, but it doesn't stick. The internal system doesn't recognize external validation as authoritative. It has its own criteria, and those criteria are rarely spoken out loud. They exist as a feeling of not yet, not ready, not complete, not allowed to stop. For many people, this system formed quietly in response to life. It wasn't chosen, it wasn't consciously installed. It emerged as a way of staying functional, acceptable, or safe in environments where ease wasn't reliably supported. So again, it's important to say this clearly. This is not a personal failure, it's an adaptation that never got updated. The problem is that when an adaptation becomes permanent, it starts producing outcomes it was never designed to handle. What once helped you navigate complexity now prevents you from inhabiting your own life. And the longer it runs, the more normal it feels. People often mistake this internal punishment system for their conscience, or their drive, or their integrity. They say things like, "I wouldn't be who I am without it." And that fear makes sense because the system has been positioned as the thing keeping everything intact. But notice what it actually produces. It produces hesitation where there could be movement. It produces guilt where there could be rest. It produces pressure where there could be presence. And perhaps most quietly of all, it produces distance from yourself. You're always a step away, watching, adjusting, evaluating, rarely just here. This is why the phrase internal punishment matters, not because it's harsh, but because it reveals something important. Punishment is not about cruelty, it's about control. And this system is fundamentally about control, maintaining order by applying pressure from the inside. Once you see that, something shifts. Not because you suddenly know how to stop it, but because you realize you're not dealing with a flaw that needs fixing. You're dealing with a structure that has been misidentified as your nature. And that distinction changes how you relate to everything that follows, because you don't argue with a structure, you don't shame it, you don't try to outwork it, you start by seeing it clearly. In the next movement, we're going to look at what this system does to passion and consistency, and why so many people lose momentum, not because they don't care, but because caring has become inseparable from pressure. And once that connection is visible, a lot of self-blame quietly dissolves. If you've ever looked at your own life and wondered why you can feel genuine desire for something, even excitement, and then somehow lose access to it a few weeks later, this is usually where people start blaming themselves. They call it procrastination, lack of discipline, lack of clarity, a commitment issue, a motivation issue. They start building stories about why they can't sustain anything, why they always start and stop, why they can't keep the energy alive. What's almost never questioned is the environment that passion is trying to live inside of, because passion is not only about what you want, it's about what your system can tolerate while you move toward it. A lot of people imagine passion as a flame that should just stay lit if the desire is real enough. That's not how it works in a nervous system that has learned to treat every meaningful action as a test. When internal punishment is running in the background, Passion is never allowed to be simple. It gets converted into a performance review. You want something, and almost immediately that wanting is followed by an evaluation of whether you're doing it properly, whether you're doing it quickly enough, whether you're doing it consistently enough, whether your effort matches your standards, whether you can sustain it, whether you'll embarrass yourself, whether this is a waste of time, whether it's too late, whether you're delusional. The desire doesn't get to exist on its own. It becomes a contract, and contracts create pressure. This is why people often say they love the beginning of things. The beginning has air in it. The beginning is permission. It's an idea, a possibility, a new identity that hasn't yet been measured. In the beginning, you can feel alive without being evaluated because nothing has been established yet. But once the thing becomes real, once it becomes a plan, once you start showing up, once it begins to matter, the internal system steps forward and starts doing what it believes it must do. It begins to monitor, correct, tighten the rules, raise the stakes. The same desire that felt like freedom at the start now feels like an obligation you have to justify, and the body registers obligation as weight. When people ask for consistency, they usually imagine they need a better strategy, a more disciplined schedule, a routine they can maintain. But most collapses don't happen because someone didn't know what to do. They happen because the act of doing has been made psychologically expensive. You're not just writing or creating or building or training or learning. You're proving something while you do it. You're trying to earn permission. You're trying to avoid shame. You're trying to outrun the feeling of being behind. You're trying to silence the internal voice that questions whether you deserve to want what you want. That is not sustainable fuel. It might produce bursts of output, but it doesn't produce a life you can stay inside. You can see this clearly in the pattern of effort and collapse. There's often a phase where someone becomes intensely productive, almost rigid, almost obsessive. They suddenly get serious. They tighten everything. They remove joy. They remove softness. They try to force a breakthrough by sheer pressure. And for a while, it can look impressive, even to them, because the punishment system is satisfied when pressure is being applied. It reads pressure as control. It reads strain as responsibility. It reads exhaustion as proof. Then, inevitably, something in the body begins to resist. They wake up one day and can't do it anymore. They feel numb. They feel repelled by the very thing they wanted. They tell themselves they've lost passion, when what actually happened is that passion has been suffocated by surveillance. This is also why doubt becomes sticky. Doubt is not just a thought, it becomes a posture. If you're constantly evaluating yourself, doubt is the natural atmosphere, because evaluation requires uncertainty. If you were certain, the system would have nothing to do, so it keeps you slightly unsure, slightly unfinished, slightly not there yet. And this can show up in very ordinary ways that people don't connect to internal punishment. You might notice you keep researching instead of starting, because research feels like responsibility and starting feels like exposure. You might notice you keep refining instead of finishing, because refinement feels safe and completion feels like something you'll be judged on. You might notice you keep changing plans, not because the plans are wrong, but because the moment a plan becomes stable, it becomes a target for your own scrutiny. The guilt loop fits into this the same way. Guilt isn't only about doing something wrong. In this system, guilt becomes the price you pay for being human. If you rest, guilt appears. If you choose one thing over another, guilt appears. If you enjoy something, guilt appears. If you say no, guilt appears. The system interprets guilt as a sign that you are still committed to being a good person, still committed to not becoming careless, still committed to staying right. So even when guilt hurts, the mind often treats it as evidence of integrity. That's why it can be so hard to release, because part of you believes that without guilt, you would become someone you don't respect. The tragedy is that guilt doesn't actually create integrity. It creates tension, and tension creates avoidance, and avoidance creates more guilt, and the cycle reinforces itself. If you step back far enough, you can see that the real issue is not that people can't maintain habits. The issue is that they've built their life on the idea that they must be corrected in order to be safe. Under that belief, passion becomes dangerous because it carries risk, it carries visibility, it carries the possibility of disappointment, it carries the possibility of wanting and not getting, so the system does what it thinks will protect you. It converts passion into pressure because pressure feels like control. It converts desire into a standard because standards feel like safety. It converts movement into a test because tests feel like a way to prevent future regret. And then people wonder why they feel exhausted by their own dreams. This is why the request for something maintainable is more profound than it sounds. Maintainability isn't about finding the perfect routine. Maintainability is about being able to live without constant internal consequence. When every deviation becomes a moral failure, when every low energy day becomes evidence that you're not the kind of person you hoped you were, you will always swing between pushing and collapsing. You will always be rebuilding yourself from scratch because the system never allows you to stabilize into a normal human rhythm. A normal rhythm includes inconsistency, it includes seasons, it includes days where you do less, days where you do more, days where you're inspired, days where you're quiet. Internal punishment interprets that normal rhythm as unacceptable, and it tries to correct it, and that correction is what creates the instability. So when people say they want to live without perpetual doubt, worry, and guilt, what they're really saying is that they want to be able to move through life without being internally fined for being alive. They want to create, to build, to love, to work, to rest, without the constant sense that they are failing some invisible test. They want a life that doesn't require them to be at war with themselves to keep going. And if this is landing, then the next question is not, how do I force myself to be better? The next question is what it would mean for the system to no longer require punishment in order to allow movement at all, because that is where the possibility of a regulated life actually begins. When the system that's been applying pressure finally loosens its grip, the change is rarely dramatic. There's no sudden rush of confidence, no moment where doubt disappears forever, no sense that life has been solved. What changes first is much quieter than that. The atmosphere inside you shifts. The constant feeling of being assessed begins to thin out, and in its place there's a strange, unfamiliar neutrality. Things start to feel less charged, less consequential, less loaded with meaning that has to be managed. At first, this can feel disorienting. Many people expect relief to feel like happiness, but relief often feels like nothing in particular. It feels like not bracing. It feels like not rehearsing explanations. It feels like not needing to justify what you're doing or why you're doing it, even to yourself. The absence of punishment doesn't announce itself as freedom. It shows up as the absence of internal commentary where there used to be constant narration. This is important because when people imagine living without internal punishment, they often picture becoming carefree or irresponsible. They imagine losing their edge, their seriousness, their standards. What actually happens is that effort becomes quieter. You still care, you still act, you still make choices, but those choices are no longer wrapped in a story about what they say about you as a person. Action stops being a referendum on your worth, and because of that, it stops draining you in the same way. One of the first things people notice is that rest begins to feel different. Not euphoric, not indulgent, but real. Rest starts doing what rest is supposed to do, which is restore. When punishment is present, rest is shallow. The body may stop moving, but the system stays alert. Thoughts keep circling, the mind keeps checking. There's an underlying sense that this pause needs to be temporary, justified, or productive in some way. When punishment is no longer required, rest loses that edge. You stop resting against something, you rest because you're tired, and that's enough. Action changes in a similar way. Instead of needing to feel motivated in order to begin, you find yourself moving simply because movement is the natural next step. There's less inner negotiation, less waiting for the right mood, less pressure to perform the action correctly. This doesn't mean everything becomes easy. It means difficulty stops feeling like evidence that something is wrong. Effort becomes effort again rather than a test you're constantly afraid of failing. Another subtle shift happens around decision-making. When punishment is running the show, decisions are heavy. They feel permanent, defining, risky. You try to think your way into certainty before acting because certainty feels like protection. When punishment loosens, decisions become more provisional. You make the best call you can with the information you have, and you trust that adjustment is allowed. This doesn't make you careless, it makes you responsive. You stop needing to get it right the first time in order to feel safe moving forward. It's also here that guilt begins to lose its authority, not because you've decided guilt is bad and not because you've reasoned your way out of it, but because the system no longer needs it as a regulator. Guilt only has leverage in a system that believes pressure is necessary for order. When order is restored through stability rather than correction, guilt becomes less convincing. It may still appear, especially out of habit, but it no longer dictates your behavior. You notice it without reorganizing your life around it. This is where many people are surprised, and they expect that without guilt, they'll stop caring about others or about the consequences of their actions. What they actually find is that care becomes cleaner. You respond because something matters, not because you're afraid of being a bad person if you don't. Responsibility shifts from being enforced to being chosen, and chosen responsibility is far more sustainable than responsibility maintained through fear. Passion too begins to return, but not in the way people usually expect. It doesn't come back as intensity, it comes back as steadiness. You're able to stay with something even when it's not exciting, because staying no longer feels like self-surveillance. You're able to enjoy moments of inspiration without immediately turning them into obligations. You're able to let interest rise and fall without interpreting that fluctuation as a character flaw. Passion becomes something you participate in, not something you have to protect or extract. What's really happening here is that the nervous system is recalibrating. A system that no longer expects punishment no longer needs to stay hypervigilant. And a system that isn't hypervigilant doesn't need constant reassurance. It can tolerate uncertainty, it can tolerate imperfection, it can tolerate pauses, it can tolerate being human without immediately sounding an alarm. This is why life begins to feel more maintainable at this stage, not because you've found the perfect balance, but because the internal penalties for imbalance have been removed. You're allowed to have off days without turning them into a narrative about your failure. You're allowed to change direction without framing it as quitting. You're allowed to move slowly without accusing yourself of falling behind. The system stops demanding explanations for normal fluctuations in energy and attention. Importantly, none of this requires you to become passive. Living without internal punishment doesn't mean you drift through life without intention. It means intention is no longer enforced through threat. You still choose, you still commit, you still engage. But those choices are no longer made under duress. They're made from a baseline of permission rather than a baseline of self-suspicion. And perhaps the most significant change is this. When punishment is no longer required, you stop living as if you're on trial. You're no longer gathering evidence to prove that you deserve your life, your rest, your interests, your relationships. You're no longer trying to reach some invisible threshold where you'll finally be allowed to relax into who you are. Life stops feeling like something you have to pass and starts feeling like something you're actually in. This doesn't make everything perfect. Doubt still visits. Worry still shows up from time to time. Guilt may still flicker, but they no longer sit in the central seat. They become information rather than authorities. They're part of the landscape, not the governing body. And that shift, while quiet, changes everything about how a life unfolds, because a system that is no longer punishing itself no longer needs to be controlled into coherence. It begins to organize naturally around what can actually be lived day after day without collapse. When people imagine a life without internal punishment, they often picture a kind of permanent calm, or a version of themselves that never doubts, never hesitates, never feels conflicted. That image alone can make the whole idea feel unrealistic, even naive. But living without internal punishment was never about eliminating difficulty. It was about no longer treating difficulty as evidence that you are doing something wrong by existing. What actually changes at this stage is not your emotional range, but your relationship to it. You stop interpreting every uncomfortable feeling as a summons to correct yourself. Sadness no longer means you failed to be grateful enough. Uncertainty no longer means you're irresponsible. Low energy no longer means you're wasting your life. These states still arise, but they no longer automatically trigger an internal investigation. This is where life begins to feel inhabitable again. Instead of constantly asking yourself whether you're doing enough, you start responding to what's actually here. If you're tired, you rest. If you're interested, you engage. If something matters, you tend to it. Not because you're afraid of the consequences if you don't, but because responding feels natural when you're not under threat from yourself. Action becomes contextual rather than moralized. You do what fits the moment instead of what might finally silence an inner critic. Living without internal punishment doesn't mean you stop caring about the quality of your life. It means you stop using fear as the mechanism that enforces that care. You still have values, you still have preferences, you still have limits, but they're no longer upheld through tension. They're upheld through familiarity, through a sense of what feels workable, sustainable, and honest over time. One of the clearest signs that this shift is happening is that you stop narrating your life as a problem to be solved. There's less internal commentary about where you should be by now, less comparison to imaginary timelines, less self-talk that frames your current moment as a temporary failure state you need to escape from. You begin to meet your own life as it is, not as a placeholder for something better you haven't earned yet. This is what it means to step out of probation. Probation is living as if your worth is conditional, as if you're being monitored by an invisible authority that hasn't yet decided whether you're allowed to settle. It's the sense that relief will come later, once you've proven something, once you've fixed enough, once you've arrived somewhere more acceptable. Most people don't realize how deeply this idea structures their inner world. They're always almost allowed, almost finished, almost there. And because almost has no endpoint, they never fully arrive in their own life. When internal punishment loosens, that orientation dissolves, not all at once, and not through effort, but through recognition. You see that the system keeping you in a state of self-correction was never going to grant permission, because permission was never the point. Control was, safety was, and once that becomes clear, the urgency around fixing yourself begins to fall away. What replaces it isn't apathy, it's a quieter form of responsibility, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. You take care of things because they matter to you, not because you're afraid of who you'll become if you don't. You show up because you're involved, not because you're being watched. This is where people often say life feels simpler, even though nothing has been simplified. The same challenges exist, the same uncertainties exist, the same world exists. But the internal friction that made everything feel heavier than it needed to be is gone. And without that friction, you discover that much of what you were struggling to force actually unfolds more easily on its own. A regulated life is not a life without movement. It's a life without constant internal consequence. It's a life where you're allowed to adjust without self-punishment, where you're allowed to learn without shame, where you're allowed to rest without guilt, where you're allowed to want things without turning those wants into burdens. This is also where passion becomes something you live with rather than chase. You don't need to extract meaning from every action. You don't need to turn every interest into an identity. You don't need to maximize every moment. You stay with what's alive for you, and when it changes, you let it change. Not because you've given up, but because you trust that life doesn't require constant self-enforcement to keep moving. Perhaps the most profound shift is this: when you stop punishing yourself internally, you stop organizing your life around avoiding regret. You begin organizing it around presence. You respond to what's here rather than what you fear might happen if you don't get it right. You live less in anticipation and more in participation. This is not a dramatic transformation, it's a quiet one. It's the slow realization that you don't need to be harsher with yourself to be a good person, or more tense to be responsible, or more doubtful to be wise. It's the understanding that a life lived under constant correction is not a life lived deeply, no matter how disciplined it appears from the outside. A good life is not built by monitoring yourself into worthiness. It's built by removing the internal conditions that made worthiness feel negotiable in the first place. When that negotiation ends, you don't become perfect. You become available to your own life as it is, without waiting for a verdict that never needed to be delivered. And that is what it actually means to live without internal punishment.